Yoser. Yep.
Well, my numbers are going up now. There's 7.
Yep. People are getting into the room. I'm very excited for today's webinar.
He's letting people in, sort of, Ben is.
I think the system, the Zoom lets people in automatically once we open the gate. So anybody who's joining us now has been probably in a waiting room.
Yeah.
And then we'll wait a minute or two and do an introduction, and we'll have today's presentation and webinar.
Okay. And so right now they can see you and me.
Yes, they can.
Okay. And we can see Ben's name, but not Ben.
That's right. So our friend Ben is in the background for technical support in case we have any snafus.
Okay.
And Kenwin says, yes, we can hear and see 2 of you.
Well, that's probably good because there's only 2 of us, I think.
So Dr. Dave, apparently there are some groupies in the room of yours.
Really?
Maggie joining, remember me, MSW 2016.
Maggie, hi.
Yeah.
I can't, you may or may not know this, but I cannot see you. So I just, but Christoph told me you're inside my computer because I can see, I thought I'd see little pictures, but I can't. So, but anyway, thanks for joining.
All right, Sarah says 110% group here too.
Moira, I can't believe Moira would want 2 Dr. Daves in one class. I mean, one day, 2 Dr. Dave classes.
Oh yeah.
That's
she's one of your students then?
Yes, Moira is in my afternoon class. Yeah.
And there's another groupie, Sandy is in there.
Groupie.
Lucy, my friend Lucy. Hola, Christoph. Lucy from the Red Iguana. So
Christoph has groupies too.
That's a great restaurant, by the way, everyone. If you need some good Mexican comfort and awesome food.
Yes.
Red Iguana and Red Iguana 2.
Yes, and Red Iguana 2 is much less crowded.
It is, and just as good.
It is just as good.
Yeah, Lucy. Those were the good days. We biked to the Camino de Santiago. Her husband.
Oh, I met Lucy. So Lucy, I don't know if you remember, but you were on KRCL. You've probably been on KRCL 100 times, but I was on with you once as the community host. Like, I think it was before, or I think it was maybe in March or April, right after COVID started. And we were talking about business and restaurants.
And we are on.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, today. Yes, and Lucy writes back, of course, she remembers the Camino. It is one of those, again, today's, let me start with this. And the Camino de Santiago actually is very apropos, and the pandemic on what we all go through is apropos to today's topic. We're going to talk about the opportunities of individual and collective transformation in our current convergence of pandemic, protests, and politics. He is known as Dr. Dave Derezotes. There's a long list, faculty at the College of Social Work. He's also the director of Peace and Conflict Studies at the College of Humanities. He's on Ruth Watkins, that's our president. So everybody who doesn't know her, Ruth Watkins is our president, and he is heading the anti-racism task force there. He is also the project director of transforming classrooms into inclusive communities. He has a fantastic program on KRCL, one of our local wonderful radio stations, The Radical Middle. If you haven't listened to it, it's a fantastic program. And he's the chair of the Diversity and Social Justice Committee. I know there's a lot more to say. Welcome, Dr. Dave Derezotes. How are you doing?
I'm medium. How about
medium?
You? Yes. Yeah.
Today we're gonna run it a little bit different. Usually we say we're gonna wait for the questions and answers till the end. But if anyone who's in the room now and has joined us, 2 things: we're doing an exercise at the end. If you would like to stay around for that, Dr. Dave will speak more about this, but we have Q&As and chats on the bottom of your screen. Um, Dr. Dave will interrupt his own presentation here and there, and we will check in with some of those questions that you might have. Once I leave the room, I might come back and facilitate those questions a little bit on behalf and for you, as Dr. Derezotes loves to be more mano a mano with our audience versus just a presentation. So I'm looking forward to this today. I'm super stoked and excited. If I forgot to mention anything about you, please introduce yourself, and I'll be in the background. I'll be here, and every now and then frequently take over and read out these questions. And I want to thank our partners at the Alumni Association and all the colleges who have been mentioned already this morning. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Christoph. Do you know why I said medium, by the way?
I do not know, no.
I do that. Some of you know because I see you at school, or back in the old days when we actually were face to face. Because in our culture, as you all know, we say "How are you," and sometimes we don't mean it. I know Christoph means it, but sometimes we don't really want to hear. And medium is sort of a way to create a conversation, because if I ask you how you are, I actually really want to know. And a lot of us say, "Oh, I'm great," but we're really not, because there's this, don't you think there's this expectation? And it's sort of, I can segue from this into our conversation today,
And
that,
the Germans are usually brutally honest. And so,
uh,
yes, it is in our culture too that we don't necessarily always ask the question, how are you? And anticipating just to hear, oh, well, thank you. So it does go a little bit against my cultural grain, but I guess I adopted it too. So here I am. I did mean it though. And
yes,
I do hope you are in, not just in the middle, but hopefully somewhere on the
yeah,
back
well,
side
medium is pretty good because it's above half of the worst, so. And I hope all of you listening are at least medium today. We're in a tough time together, aren't we? And I want to talk with you about this. What I'm used to is, teaching in a circle face to face and having a conversation. That's why I'll stop every once in a while. And I really do benefit from your comments and questions, okay? Because I mean, I know some of you are there because you identified yourselves, but I can't even see you. Um, I want to talk about what we're all sharing together on Earth, don't you think? Which is, having to deal with all these things. A lot of them start with the letter P. So we have pandemic and protests and pandemonium and other things I can't figure out how to say them with a P, but we have, windstorms, fires, race relations, polarization, there's a P word. And there is a convergence of it in 2020. And probably for the rest of our lives, we'll think about 2020 that way. And today, I'd like to talk with you about not just, the symptoms that come up for most of us in reaction to, this convergence of all these challenges, but also how these challenges are opportunities for us, for me and you and people not just in Utah, but in the US, and not just in the US, but all over the world, don't you think, to change. And like Ram Dass says, I don't even know that there's a God, or I won't talk with him or her until I'm suffering. And so suffering kind of kicks me in the butt, doesn't it do that to you? And makes me think about what's important and notice what I feel. So I usually, when I work with people, I use the whiteboard, and we have this. Uh, we have the opportunity to, to look at some things on a screen. So I'm going to share this just for a second with you, and I like to look at things from an eco-biopsychosocial spiritual perspective. And just to show you, and I'll only show you this to you for a minute or two, I promise, because I don't like anything that's like a PowerPoint any more than most of you. I call them disim PowerPoints. But just to show you quickly what how I'll organize this, oops, this is a mistake here. So I was trying to set the font size. But if you look at this chart, ecological just means the big context of what's going on in my life. And we could say that in the world today, many experts and observers of humanity say that we're in the dying stages of patriarchy. In fact, that's, I'm told, what the age of Aquarius is all about, is moving from the patriarchy into another period of time. And if we had more time, I'd talk about it because I think it's interesting and fun to think that way. And when any system is dying, it often grabs on harder and resists. And uh, we could say maybe that that's happening all over the world. Um, Maybe in families, maybe in communities, maybe in countries. Think about how many patriarchal leaders there are in many countries all over the world that are hanging on and clinging on to power. That colonization still exists on the earth, of course, and the consequences of it, but that uh, uh, there may be an opportunities we'll talk about to move from that place of colonizing other people, colonizing how um, we also think and act, not just taking land from other people. Global warming is not just a theory. And most scientists, as most of you know, agree that there is a climate change happening. And it may be the number one issue because it probably will affect our descendants. Some of my friends who are American Indians say that everything they do is encouraged by their tribe to be done in the context of what would 7 generations from now think about. My friend Francie Taylor from campus from the American Indian Resource Center was talking about that the other day. And surely climate change is going to affect the 7th generation from now. Race relations, as we all know, there's been a big reaction to the murders of some uh, Black men and women, many of them African American, by often white police. And we, if we had time, we'd spend the whole time talking about that. And these are just things going on in my world today. And then politics and the polarization. So it's become trite, hasn't it, to say that we can't talk to each other very well, and probably more accurate to say that we don't listen. We can talk to each other a lot, but we'll look at what dialogue is. And probably the number one ground rule in dialogue is listening for understanding. And even though that sounds really simple, most of us have very few people in our lives who truly listen for understanding to us, when we're having a hard time. And then, the biological is just what's happening in my body. And for sure, there's evidence that a lot of us are eating too much because we're at home. And when I eat, of course, it moves more of the blood in my body to the digestive system, and it makes my muscles relax. So I might not need that nutrition. And many people report problems with sleeping. So those are some symptoms in my body. And then on a psychological level, let's just pick two today: numbing, which is another word for depression. And in my mental health classes, I teach that when I'm bummed, which is an old 60s word, translated means depression, that I'm actually numbing things I don't want to feel. And just like our psychotropic medications, if I try to numb anything I don't like to feel, I tend to numb everything I feel. And then worry, that there's a tendency to be in my head. And worry has a function. It developed for a reason, just like depression in humans, we think. But it can become, as we all know, unhelpful. And then on a social level, many folks are not just alone, and we'll talk about the difference a little bit, but also lonely. Many folks report domestic violence or child maltreatment or both happening in their households, which just makes sense because we are able to move around less, and folks have to deal with each other. And I put household conflicts because I just was listening to an NPR program that was talking about how common that is in family conflicts these last months, especially during the pandemic, because often, and I'm a male identified person, women say rightly that men don't participate in housework. So I thought that we put that in there. And then on the spiritual level, we'll talk a little bit about ego And some signs of ego are a sense of specialness, like this shouldn't be happening to me, or why isn't the world turning out the way I want? Why can't I get my way? And a feeling of disconnection, which also tends to be ego-based. And we'll talk about how ego was designed, we think it evolved like all these other characteristics for a reason in us, but can become problematic. I like Mishra's term resentment that he has in the book, The Age of Anger, and how people all over the world, he's a intellectual from India. He says people all over the world today feel like they're being ripped off and have anger towards another group that they feel are being unfairly are unfairly getting resources or power. And I put disconnection down again and how important it is. So we may come back to this chart briefly to look at what we might call the medicines for these symptoms are. And we want to think of symptoms not as just things to fix, which is a Western medical model idea, but things to heal. And heal means in Latin to make whole. So when I heal a symptom, what I do is look at the roots of it and actually welcome instead of fight. Just notice these symptoms showing up again, not that they might not cause me pain, and try to understand what they're trying to tell me or teach me. And so that's the approach we'll take. So I'm going to try another screen. So I'm going to stop share this, and because I like to doodle on the board and I've been practicing. So let's see if I can do share screen again. And this time we'll have a whiteboard. So let's say here's me or you, and I'm on the planet, right? And we're thinking eco, bio, psychosocial, spiritual. So here's Earth. And all these things are happening at the same time for us in 2020. I've been practicing my writing, but it's still not quite the same as when I draw. And so let's say that everybody has a capacity for stress, above which we say there's distress, which means chronic stress, and it's bad, so above this line, let's say. So usually a lot of us today in these busy times, probably a lot of you that are participating in this conversation, try to operate as close to the brim as possible, and some people give these different stresses points, right? So, I try to work as many hours as I possibly can because that's what I'm supposed to do to be a good person and be productive. We're the most productive workers in the world in the U.S. and when we live in the Beehive state, which is even more productive probably than many states. So the point is that this is all filled with stress. And then in 2020, though, we just said, from an ecological perspective, the context is pandemonium, pandemic, polarization, right? Earthquakes, asteroids, windstorms, fires, and all the hurricanes and all the rest. And so the kind of stress that I'm used to handling all of a sudden is way up above, the distress level. And unless I want to operate there, which is not good for anyone's body, any animal's body, because I'm in hyper arousal and I'm prepared for fight or flight. It's just not good for my digestive system or my muscular system, my cardiovascular system, any system, right? I have to change probably something, and as you and I probably all notice, we can't change the world we're in, very easily. And it might be the only thing I actually can change is the way I look at myself in the world and maybe how I act in that world. So here I am on the planet and all these stressors are happening, and I'm more isolated than ever because, we're mammals that like intimacy, right? On the social level, we were talking about that earlier. We like connection from other people, but even with, the Zoom, and I'm an old guy. I'm a year from 70, and so I wasn't super psyched about doing Zoom, but I found, it is a connection there, and some research suggests it can be almost as good as face to face, with counseling and teaching. nevertheless, it doesn't feel the same. Like in this conversation, I'm sitting in my house, talking to a plastic machine, and with wires inside, and so are you. So there's, um, and a friend of mine who's a Buddhist monk says that Buddha 3,000 years ago talked about how everything we see is virtual. He didn't use necessarily that word because, our eyes and our nose and our ears and all the sensory organs, interpret the world, and then our minds interpret it again. And so the computer just creates another level of interpretation, right? Um, but nevertheless, most of us feel in isolation. So I'm going to put the word alone here. And what if we said that, on a social level, that aloneness, and this also is in most of our wisdom traditions, that in fact, way back in shamanism, which, if you're a human on the planet, your ancestors, if you go back far enough, had shamans as healers. They said that when you're born, I've been told in many shamanic oriented societies, tribes, groups, that you're born into aloneness and you don't go back to connection until you die. And Krishnamurti says the same thing. He's one of my favorite philosophers, I think the greatest in the last century, says that aloneness is inescapable, because, for example, I can never explain to you, even in a day, what I'm thinking and feeling right now to you, nor can you to me. We can begin to understand, but we can't completely understand what it is like to be another person. So what if being alone is just something that we face, whereas being lonely is something I can do something about? And so what's the difference? One way to think about it would be that loneliness is fighting aloneness. And so when I run from anything, because then that's fear, because fear is trying to avoid. And in the visualization we're going to do at the end of our conversation today, I'm going to do work with you around facing fear about all these things that threaten us, that cause this stress to go so high, as one technique. And the other technique would be affirmation of what I hope would happen, knowing that whenever I get my way, when my ego gets its way in the world, it's always only temporary. So I'm just going to stop for a second. And Christoph told me that you can communicate to me through chat. So if anybody has anybody put a comment or question, Christoph, into the chat network?
Dr. Dave, I currently don't see
Okay.
a comment. So
Okay.
short answer is no. But
Okay.
everybody out there, you're welcome to send in your questions if you have, or comments. We're here for you.
Okay. Yeah. So please feel. For some reason, mine says 18 chats. So I don't know why it says that, but maybe I have a different. Maybe that's coming from somewhere else. And maybe Ben knows about that. So I'm going to go back to this chart for a second and talk about, because I know you're here probably partly to talk about what are some of the quote unquote medicines for some of the things that I'm struggling with, because we all want to both heal and transform. And the title of our talk today is Transformation. And Christoph, if you find something that you want to interrupt me with, please feel free, because it'll help me a lot with what I'm trying to do.
In fact, right now, so we have some trickling in. I'm going to read them out. Sharon started saying, housework, no need to do with no visitors.
No
So yeah,
need,
that's a good comment.
what did she say? No need to do?
No need to do with no visitors. I think she's meaning to say,
Oh, I like
I
it.
do my
Yeah.
housework and I don't need anybody around. That's
Yeah.
me with cooking. If I cook, I'm in a zone.
Yeah. Thank you.
I worry that I'm getting, Kathy is saying, I'm worried that I'm getting used to the isolation and I'm pretty much enjoying it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people embrace that, of course, and some people really need to refill their tanks with human interaction,
Yeah.
energy. So that's extrovert versus introvert, right?
Yeah.
Maggie is saying, Sharon, how about how about working from home with family members present? Question mark, smiley face.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
those are great. Thank you. I'll try to weave those in as I talk with you. Um, I like
and
the comment about housework, and I like being able to laugh. Um, Probably all of you do too sometimes, because it's a tough time, and laughter seems healing for me. Um, when I ask my students how they're doing, when we meet for mental health class, for example, I would say about half of them a comment on the positives about the pandemic and being isolated, and actually enjoy sometimes being able to be at home. I was just saying to my wife yesterday how much I like not. I'm a bicycle commuter, but in the winter it sometimes is brutal, and I don't miss bicycling to campus when it's snowy and icy, and I kind of like being at home sometimes. All of our children are grown and long moved out, um, but being introverted, I feel good about that. And I guess my comment to those of you that feel that way is guilt and shame about that is probably not very helpful. I like the idea in the Course of Miracles that they say guilt is always insane, because it doesn't really help me or the other person. And I tend to agree with that. I don't think guilt, I think if all guilt disappeared from humans magically today, we'd still could operate in a loving and kind way to each other, and maybe even in a more loving and kind way. I'm not certain that guilt plays the function that we're told it plays, keeping us in line. And yeah, doing work with the family, I actually enjoy. I was just saying this to my mental health class this morning. I enjoy meeting some of my students' family. I mean, a lot of them, their family is a cat or dog. Some of them are unmarried and they don't live with their families anymore. They live in an apartment and their dog's sitting on their lap watching the screen, and that wouldn't have happened back in the old days, because they couldn't bring their doggy or cat to school. And we met one of my students' wife, this morning, and two of my male students have their little children who are 2 or 3 on their laps. And I think that's cool. It's probably some of the reasons why the researchers are finding that, that therapy and education across Zoom is just as effective as face to face and by some measures. So, what are some of the medicines for these symptoms in the world that we're dealing with? They're so
I'm gonna,
difficult. Oh,
Dr.
go
Dave, I'm
ahead.
gonna leave the room again. I'm just gonna read
Okay.
out two more comments,
Thank you.
which, and then we'll take, I will,
Okay.
be here, but
Okay.
I'll let you take over.
Thank you.
So at 12:25, Melinda said, I have felt like my ego has been out of control and it's
Yeah.
been very frustrating.
Yeah.
Um, and then we had a comment from Zoom user 531 rule. Think about 5 things I'm grateful for, 3 things to accomplish today. Be happy if one is accomplished.
I like that. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Thank you for those comments. And as long as we're talking about ego, let me go to the bottom line here. Thinking about ego, I like Eckhart Tolle's definition the best, that ego is identification with form. It's my favorite definition. And then he adds, especially mental form, beliefs. And uh, boy, you're not the only one that we could say the ego is really big right now. That one could argue that identification with mental form or belief is in pandemic. Look at how strongly we believe in our political views, for example. Now, that's always been somewhat true, probably through history, as long as we've had politics, right? Um, but certainly that has something to do with why we keep talking about polarization. Don't you all think that? And like uh, Tolle says, when I identify with the belief, it makes it possible then for me to be violent. It gives me permission to, because I am that, that is me. So I would never criticize you. I might not agree with you, but I wouldn't criticize you for believing, for example, Trump versus Biden or Biden versus Trump. I mean, we all have our thoughts about that. The point I'm making is, the belief in itself, I don't think is necessarily good or bad from a spiritual perspective, but when I identify with that belief, like let's say I identify with voting for Biden so strongly that I would, it justifies in my mind throwing a rock at you, during a counter demonstration, or, or throwing one at a police officer who's just there trying to protect buildings, right? Or even worse, blowing up. I just heard this morning, as some of you probably did, that someone, a well-known reporter, got killed in his car in Afghanistan, probably for taking a stance on something that upsets someone. So we think that um, that identification, which is an ego function, with belief, um, is one of the main reasons why there's any violence in the world, right? Including domestic violence. How dare you fill in the blank, right? Sounds like ego talking to me. But it's probably also an opportunity to heal ego. Meaning, and remember, if you buy the idea that healing is making whole, then healing ego means to notice it. And I think we can take wisdom from Krishnamurti again around this, that the way to heal ego is to just see it, without trying to change it, make it different, hide it, because basically we're ashamed of our egos. We don't like to show them. Most of us don't, right? We try to hide it because we're told it's not good to have an ego. But the fact is, we all have an ego. I do, you do. We can't take a picture of it yet in our brain, but it seems to be hardwired in humans, which is that sense of specialness. I should be the exception. I shouldn't have to suffer. I should get my way. Whenever I compare myself to other people, that's ego operating. So those are some examples of ego usually feels disconnected from everything else, when in fact there's every reason to think we are connected. And I go through sometimes a whole day feeling disconnected, and then I remind myself I'm actually not disconnected from other people, from my body, from nature, right? So to heal that, to make it whole, means to just see it. And Krishnamurti says, and I think he's right, as soon as I see ego, it doesn't have as much power, because I'm not running away from it. I'm not trying to hide it. I'm not trying to fix it. And when I'm aware of something, consciousness itself is the best medicine there is. If there's only one thing I could say in this whole column around medicines, it would be that consciousness is how we heal, and consciousness is best defined. My partner told me this when I first met her. It's still my favorite definition, um, is a reverent awareness. So meaning that seeing the world the way it is, with friendly eyes. And so it's the same idea as mindfulness, and not easy to do. And sometimes, when we teach mindfulness, we say, look at things and accept them. But I can't force myself to accept them, and certainly can't force myself to like them. But maybe I could try looking at them with a little bit more friendly eyes. That'd be so like being curious. Isn't that interesting? There is ego again, getting really big during the pandemic. Boy, it's sure big right now. It sure was activated when I watched that news show, right? And as I do that work, I can help others do that work too. So one comment on, and I'll take another break in a few minutes to get comments from you. Some comments on how to work with these symptoms that are such large scale. Kenneth Kennison said a long time ago in his research that people that are committed to something larger than themselves actually have higher or better physical and mental well-being. Just a simple idea of a commitment to something larger than myself. And he did this first studies during the Vietnam War, and he found no matter what side you took, if you were committed to trying to make social change, you were committed to try to relieve the suffering of people, that immediately changes our perspective, right? And so that's why I put commitment there, care for others. And I'll just add the outdoors, because those of you that like the outdoors like I do have probably noticed how many bazillion people there are now in our canyons, skiing with a little bit of the snow we got, or down in the desert, or up hiking on the trails, because we don't have some of the other diversions we have. And so then the downer for some of us is, oh, so many people on the trails, and does that mean I have to wear masks and all that? But the positive is, the more of us that connect with nature, which, like Hillman says, is the great healer. When all else fails, nature heals, because a tree doesn't seem to judge us. And the more that we connect with that, connect with our bodies, probably the more we are going to notice what we're doing to the earth. And what we do to the earth, the ecosystems and other living things that aren't human, we're doing to ourselves. And I'm assuming everything I'm telling you, you already know, because education means in Latin to draw out, and I think that's what it is. I'm just reminding you as I remind myself. Um, the issues around eating and sleeping, um, there's a lot of research that shows that exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, is the most powerful treatment for some of these things, as well as we go down to the next level, also of what we call anxiety and depression, which usually go together. The second most powerful treatment is what we call talk therapy or talking to a good friend. And the third would be psychotropics, either legal or illegal medicines, literal medicines that we take are the third most effective overall, right? Not in every case, not in every situation. Um, uh, a lot of my students say that exercising outside is really helpful to them. Walking the dog. You don't have to climb a great big mountain to get aerobic exercise, and having a routine seems to also help, especially with sleep problems. And most of us know that, but like what I do before I go to sleep, um, and that's a topic we could talk about for a long time. The research used to suggest that people with so-called mental illness had sleep problems, but now we know that sleep problems can lead more the other way. That insomnia, not sleeping enough, can lead to symptoms of what we call mental illness. Okay, I'll say one more, then I'll check in with Christoph. Numbing and worry it's interesting to me, are both described in the wisdom traditions of the East and West as the same thing, as being above the neck. you know uh, so you look at some of the Eastern religious and cultural traditions, and they'll say go down. If you're depressed and anxiety, go down, see what's down below the neck. In other words, see what you feel in the rest of your body, especially your heart. And Virginia Satir, famous social worker in the US, said in her practice many times, that depression and anxiety are not feelings. It's what you experience when you don't feel. So go down, she said. Same thing, right? And so finding a way to go back into my body, probably another reason why exercise helps, or doing anything where I reconnect with below the neck. It's not like we're against the head. But for sure, we're so much in our heads, especially the brain, and especially the frontal cortex of the brain, right? So noticing what I'm numbing inside, uh, and there's some little techniques that we can talk about if we have time. Let me just mention a couple really simple ones. I put down the opposite thought. So if I'm having problems sleeping, what I've noticed with folks I've worked with for years and years is just trying to vividly imagine the positive opposite of whatever I'm worrying about in my mind often helps me go to sleep. And so, for example, I might say to you, what are the top three things that you worry about this week? It might be the patriarchy, global warming, and my husband doesn't do housework or something. Who knows? Or, my mother's in a nursing home and we can't visit her and I'm afraid. And then I might say, use that imagination in your mind with intent about thinking the opposite of what you're most afraid will happen. So I'm imagining my mom in the nursing home, for example. She's okay, and we can communicate through computer or something. I imagine as vividly as I worry about it, so really seeing that. And I might imagine, if I'm worried about the pandemic, imagining that we're doing fine in it. And we'll do something like this again at the end of our time together today. And that's what the opposite thought idea really is. I also will be showing you how to face fear towards the end of this session. Um, Christoph, do you have anything from our participants?
Sure, yeah. We'll go back a little bit in time to, I'm switching over to the Q&A where we had someone ask at 12:25, how do you get rid of the guilt of wanting to go out and do things when we're social distancing?
Yeah. So guilt does not get rid of by trying to get rid of it. Have you noticed that? You know, every time I've tried to get rid of guilt or shame, and shame is like, well, guilt is, you know, they say in the Western culture, guilt is fear of punishment. In the Eastern culture, Eastern hemisphere, they often say guilt is refusal to see things the way they actually are, which is an interesting definition. You know, so guilt is there's something about that, whereas shame is like, I'm bad. So it's not just what I did or think is bad, I'm bad. And in either case, with guilt or shame, they just ain't going to go away, you know. But what I can do is use consciousness. And remember, consciousness for 6 Dr. Dave points is, and you answer, reverent awareness, whatever that is. So can I just go, isn't that interesting? I am really doing heavy guilt on myself for wanting connection with people, for wanting to go to my favorite bookstore and have a coffee again without a mask, for wanting to sing in a choir and not have to be worried about catching a virus, or, you know, or to have a sniffle and not, like Chris and I were talking before, and not have to get a COVID test, you know, 12 times a week, right? Every time I have a dry throat or something. And I would say, you know, if I look at my shame and guilt with reverent awareness and just say, isn't that interesting? Just be curious about it. Then healing happens, you know, because those are wired in me. You know, every human on the planet that I've ever met has guilt and shame. Even the people that say they don't, I think do. So I would say watch it. And another way to reduce shame and guilt, which I think are related to fear, is just feel, as the book says, feel the fear and do it anyway. So if I have guilt and shame, to notice it, you know, validate it in myself and do what I need to do. And I'm not saying do things that are going to harm other people, but try to take actions uh, that don't harm myself or other people, but that I would do if I didn't feel so strapped by guilt and shame. There might be a middle ground. And, you know, just to illustrate with a pencil, like the reason I call that show on KRCL that sometimes I do now, not as often as I used to, that Christoph was talking about, is we call it the radical middle, because the middle is usually the most radical thing to do these days, because we tend to be extremist about politics, religion, culture, race, and so on and so forth. So what would be the radical middle about shame and guilt? It would be noticing I have it, but not having to rebel. I'm not going to wear a mask because people aren't going to tell me what to do. I'm free, right? And then I infect others, or others infect me, and I, you know, hurt the people I love, perhaps. Versus the opposite, which is being so terrified that people are going to be mad at me because I'm a rule breaker. Let's say that I avoid doing anything that I could do in a safe way. So that's my response to that. Do you have another one, Christoph?
Yeah, we do. And I do like seeing the world as it is with friendly eyes, as a definition for consciousness. That I like that. I wrote it down for myself to keep.
Cool.
I'm going to go back to some of the comments just really quickly. Darcy was saying, I'm doing my best to be in a space of relaxed awareness. I think that's exactly what we were just talked about.
Yeah.
Sarah made a comment at 12:31. The identification also adds justification to defend that belief/self as an act of self-preservation. Barbara would like to know the spelling, who that philosopher is that you keep referring to. I think it was Mishra.
Krishnamurti, Krishnamurti. You don't have to buy any of his books. He's not alive anymore. You can go on the website they made for him and read about him.
All right.
As far as before you go further, let me just say a couple things. I want to hear more about the person that says they're trying their best. I really do believe this. One of my favorite professors said this to me a zillion years ago. People do the best they can under the circumstances as they see them, you know, and I believe that you're doing the best you can. And my hope would be you can give yourself a break about that, because trying to be super spiritual is self-defeating, as some of our writers have said, that then ego's involved in it, because I got to be the best spiritual person, and of course that's actually not very spiritual, probably. And it's very easy to slip into ego and trying to be the best. Um, my favorite therapist years ago said to me, David, why don't you just try to be a good enough father, a good enough partner, a good enough professor? And I didn't talk to him for a month. I was pissed at him because he was absolutely right. And so I'd say also, why don't you just make the goal of being good enough because that's achievable. What else do you have, Christoph?
Pascal wrote, but how do we help ego become whole? I think we spoke to that.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. I'm switching over to, again, at roughly the same, a few minutes later, Pascal wrote, I periodically remind myself that I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions.
Yeah.
It helps me calm myself.
Yeah, it helps me too. Because I didn't know that was true when I was a young man. I was such a good worrier. And Pascal, you know what the two things are that are associated with the best worriers is not warriors, but worriers is high intelligence and creativity. So if you're an expert worrier, you're probably very smart and creative, you know, and it's just using the computer in a negative way. Um, uh, and as far as healing ego, um, just seeing it is healing it, with curious eyes, just being curious about it. Isn't that interesting? Ego showed up again, right? And it will till the day I die, because it's wired in me.
Deneb is asking, or making a comment. Let's see, it's a longer thing. I find myself in an interesting dilemma during this time of high level politics and the pandemic. As I read about anti racism and community involvement, and then reflect from my place of safe social distancing, I find that the only thing slash action I can actually do is to go within myself. Meditation, thinking before I speak, thinking before I write or hit send. It has been a really good lesson for me. I have found great benefit in slowing down.
I
Denep,
like,
I'm on your side with that too.
yeah.
Nowadays, I, I even write it out and then never sending it. But yes,
There's and I can't remember his name right now, but if you put this quote in, you can find it. There's a activist in Africa who is says on his website, "The times are urgent. We must slow down." And I have that on my door in my university office because I love that saying. Because typically what we do in our culture is the times are urgent. We must go faster, right? So I like that comment a lot. Thank you. And Christoph, I really appreciate you taking the time to read these. This really helps me relate to the people. Anything else you want to read now?
for now, I'm going to leave the, not that I leave the room, but I'm going to make myself invisible, have you
Okay.
take over again.
Okay.
It's 12:48, just for your
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. I'm gonna. Thanks, Christoph. I'm gonna talk a little bit more at you for maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll do a guided imagery and talk about that briefly, and then all of a sudden we'll be done. So uh, to look at social for a sec, which we identified, and in this column over here, I think you can see my cursor. I really like the idea of truth telling, which is hard. It's hard for me. It's probably hard for you, because sometimes truth is scary to say, and we pay a price, right? But in this era, don't you think, and it's not because we have mass media and Twitter and social media. It's because we're human, but these things probably make it easier to say whatever we want to say anonymously. Just like, might have it together all day long, but when I'm on Foothill Drive trying to get to campus and someone cuts me off, then gives me the finger, because I'm in the car and I feel safer, then I can scream and yell and feel self-righteous, right? And upset everybody else in my car. And maybe social media is like that because I'm a little bit more anonymous, instead of inside a car, I'm separate from you, um, but can I, I can't make, some politicians tell the truth, but I could tell the truth, right? I can't change how people are treating each other in Congress, but I could listen to somebody that has a different belief than me, right? I can't make myself completely happy maybe every moment, but I could focus more on people that are suffering more than me. for example, in this pandemic, we know that people of color are disproportionately affected, and what can I do about that? And just going down to the next line, this idea of Tonglen that Pema Chodron talks about is such an easy technique from Buddhism that we can all learn in just a few minutes and get better at the rest of our lives. And the whole idea boils down to, using just one cycle of breath and pair it with meditation. And the idea is when I breathe in, I imagine breathing in my suffering instead of running away from it, which is just the opposite of what we do. When we suffer, I do it, you do it. The tendency is to not want it because we like pleasure, right? But just for a second to just feel it. I'm going to feel my suffering. And then on the out breath, there's that little space between the in breath and the out breath. And on the out breath, I breathe out goodness or even love, if you want to use that word, for myself, and on subsequent breaths for other people. And for me, like the fastest way to turn around myself if I'm having a bummer day is to think about people that are suffering more than me. And it's hard to do, but if just simply by asking someone how they are and meaning it, and then just not taking their answer, but looking at them and saying, well, no, I want to know how you are, or even just like Pema Chodron says with Tonglen, just imagining the suffering of other people in the pandemic that are suffering more than me, and you don't have to be a saint. I'm no saint, to do this, and it's just a simple thing that, and actually I do it for very selfish reasons because it makes me feel better. And like I used to be hung up on being selfish, and one of my favorite professors said to me, a mentor said a long time ago, look, you can't not be selfish. Everything humans do is selfish. So just be selfish in a way that doesn't cause harm and that might do good. And that's really helped me. It helps relieve that guilt we were talking about earlier. Okay. So what I'd like to try to do is a brief visualization. And, since we can't see each other, I don't think, or you can see me, but I can't see you. You don't have to turn off anything to do this, but just simply to close your eyes. It's only lasts like 8 minutes about. And, um, and if you will, just experiment with this idea. And this is just one approach of many to dealing with some of the things we were just talking about on the eco level, bio, psychosocial, and spiritual, these kinds of challenges that we have today, to turn them into, to healing and transformation. So if you would close your eyes, if that helps you, you don't have to. So when I close my eyes, maybe the first thing I notice is my mind, because I've had a busy day here in Utah, and when I'm busy, I don't always notice my thoughts as much as when I try to close my eyes and go to sleep or take a nap. So I can be curious about whatever is in my head and just watch those thoughts. And it's usually true that if I watch a thought in my mind, it just floats by like a cloud. And another thing I can notice with my eyes closed as I watch my thoughts is just taking inventory of my body, that wonderful thing that carries me around. And I sort of identify with it. I don't want it to get older. I don't want it to be in pain. But there might be places in my body right now that feel stressed or uncomfortable. And there might be parts that feel good. My body might be tired or energized. And I can just be curious about that too. And just like with my thoughts, I can watch, my perceptions of that just float by like a cloud goes by in the sky. And I'm a really busy person, and I do so many things for everybody every day. And maybe it's okay to spend a couple minutes now just doing some healing with myself and transformation work, because it not only helps me, but it might help me help others. And so there's two experiments I might want to try. And the first one This comes from Ram Dass's ideas about facing the things we fear. So I can imagine that all these things that are difficulties have the very worst outcomes that I am most afraid could happen. So, for example, with the elections, whoever I'm most afraid would get elected, or maybe I have fears about the transition if someone new's coming into an office, or maybe I have fears about, some of my students talk about fears of civil war in the United States, on and on. So I'm just going to notice maybe the three biggest fears I have right now that could be on the ecological level, could be on what we're calling biological, psychological, social, or spiritual. And as I notice those things I'm most afraid of, I can imagine for a moment, knowing it's just imagination, I can imagine those things happening, right? And then also imagine and hold, just like I have two hands, I can hold in one hand this idea that these very worst things in my mind that could happen are happening. And then in my other hand, I can hold the idea that I am still okay. So the very worst thing could happen. The worst person that I can't imagine being president for 4 years is elected. And for example, and then still I can see that I would be okay if that happened. And the people I love would be okay if that happened. And all the people on the world would be okay if that happened. I can imagine that. And even that the earth is still going to go around, spinning and going in orbit around the sun. And maybe even that the sun's traveling in the galaxy and the sun's okay. And maybe even the universe is okay, whatever that it actually is. And see if I could hold those two things at the same time. In one hand, the things I'm most afraid of happening, and that everything's okay. Can I do that? And maybe I can try one other thing, sort of the opposite. And this comes from all the people that have talked about and invented affirmations. And so I can also imagine that I get my way, which is my ego. And the world is exactly the way I want it to be, And that day may happen today, or maybe it happens in a week or 6 months, but that day comes. And whatever I want to see happen with the pandemic happens. And whatever I want to see happen with colonization or race relations or my overeating, for example, or my anxiety or my ego buildup or my loneliness or my conflicts with the people I love, whatever it is that's troubling me the most, I get my way and it goes away, or whatever I want it is, whatever I want to have happen. And as I imagine that, maybe for one or two or even three things, if you can hold all of them for a moment. And as I imagine getting my way, or my ego getting its way, however you want to put it, I also can hold with two hands the following. In the one hand, I can imagine in my mind's eye getting my way. And in the other hand, at the same time, I can imagine that it's only temporary. And that, as we all know, as I know, that it won't last forever. And maybe in a minute or a day or an hour, but as sure as anything, things will not go my way. Maybe something else will happen. Some new problem will happen, as the wise man said, or the wise woman. Um, she said, everybody has 82 problems. That's a special rule, in the world. You can't escape that. The only problem you can avoid is the 83rd problem. And that is that I shouldn't have 82 problems. That's the only avoidable problem. So in that same way of thinking, I might be able to avoid 3 or 82 problems for one glorious minute or day or hour. And then some other problems will show up. But holding both those things in my hand, can I also imagine that I'm still okay? That when I get my way, I can see it philosophically as a temporary condition, and I don't grasp on it and have to hold on to it, but I can just enjoy it in the moment. And it's fine to enjoy a great time and a good day and things going my way. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I can also at the same moment realize it's just not going to last. And that's okay. So in that temporariness of everything, I can imagine that I'm okay. The people I love are okay. And all the people in the world are okay. And again, the earth, that planet we live on that we've heated up and dirtied, that's okay. The earth's okay. And the sun that goes around and the universe it's in, it's all okay. I can imagine that and hold all those things at the same time. Can I do that? And before I come back, I can acknowledge whatever difficult thoughts and feelings this visualization came up and brought up for me. And that those are okay. I can just be curious about them. They were probably there way before I made them more aware, before I did this work today. And when I'm ready, I can open my eyes and come back for the last 8 or 10 minutes or so that we have together. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit, or I can respond to your chats. So I'm going to check in with Christoph again and see do you have anything else?
Everybody's just returning, I guess.
Okay, so yeah, so when you come back, if you want to make a comment about what we just did or have a question, I'd love to hear it.
What was interesting for me, and I don't know what it means or not, but it was either related to other people, my worries, meaning, I'm a father of a 10-year-old,
Right.
or it was sadly things that I do utterly feel um, out of control, out of,
Yeah.
no matter what I do, I will not be the one who can
Right.
change
Right.
what I'm worried about. For me, what's obviously climate change is very much on my mind.
Yeah.
And just seeing the recent storm patterns crossing the U.S. I mean, we're running out of names. Next thing you know, we just give them numbers.
Right.
That's, I mean, things like that. And although I do know that I can change little things on myself, I feel like I'm insignificant enough
Yeah.
to do no good.
Yeah.
That
So
was a little bit for me.
so when Christoph says that, the first thing I want to do is validate, and say, yeah, me too. I don't even have control over what's going on in my yard, how much snow falls on the ground. And I don't even have stuff, I don't even have control in my house about how much dust accumulates on my, the little rocks I have on my desk, right? But maybe I can change the way I look at myself in the world. And I just saw this the other day, and I loved this idea that it said that the obstacles in my life to my happiness are only obstacles until I change my relationship with them. And it's an interesting idea, that the things that I think are, for example, I wish I could control things. And so if I looked at what's my relationship with my inability to control things, if I fight it and I'm angry about it, it just makes it worse. And I could experiment with changing that. Like, what if that's just the way it is? As much as I'd like to change things, you know, I can't. And and I'm not saying this because I'm a master at this. I'm just saying this because we all know this is true, right? You don't need a sage in the room to point this out. It's just something we work on slowly, I think, and strive to get better at it. Anything else show up, Christoph?
Yeah, so Chuck made a comment question. If all is okay, how do we make changes?
Well, um, uh, I think that it's wise to focus on changing the things I can change, right? And like they say in AA and some of the other A's, you know, uh, accept the things I can't change and know the difference. So maybe that is wisdom. Um, so what can I change? The ways that I view myself, for sure I can shift them. The ways I view things that can change. So I would say, look at some of the ways you view things that might not help. Are you trying to change things you can't change? And then you get frustrated about that. Then you get down on yourself or resentful towards other people. Those are things that I could work on. They're not easy. Like I'm not happy, like most of you aren't happy with some of the ways people treat each other in the spaces I'm in, including myself. But I don't have direct power for that, you know. But I don't have to like it, but I could accept it, you know. And I could change the way that I am towards them, which I'm not always good at, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
I'm just realizing through this hour of conversation, but listening to you more, obviously, that I'm a little bit more in control of my own thoughts than I thought I am.
Yeah,
So thank you
yeah,
for,
especially, yeah, for sure. I mean, what I can't do and you probably can't do, like if I said, Christoph, don't think about an elephant for 2 seconds. You can't, and I can't either. So that in that way, I can't control my thoughts. For sure, I can't. And I've never been able to just have a blank brain for an hour. You'd have to, give me a lobotomy, and maybe it would help. But I what I can do is watch my thoughts and be curious about them, and that definitely lowers my blood pressure and my heart rate.
all right, Maggie's writes, wow, I have so much to say, too much to type, so I'm resorting to my journal. I'm loving this, very aligned, very aligned. And Dr. D, I have been meaning to get in touch, catch up a bit,
Oh,
and I know you're a busy guy.
yeah,
Feeling so grateful for this opportunity to listen to you again. It has been too long.
not too busy to talk, so let me know. I use my journal a lot. Here's my latest one. I got this over at Recreation Outlet for 50 cents or something. I really like it, and as you can see, I draw little drawings in it and stuff, and I take it with me when I go camping, and I think it's really helpful. It's not for all of us, but it always listens to me and doesn't talk back, and it helps me sort of get in touch with what I'm thinking and feeling. So I think it's a great suggestion, journaling. Anything else? We just got a few
Yes,
minutes.
Belinda, when you said, can we hold both in our hands? The thing that happens that I don't want and everyone will be okay. It took me a moment. No, I can't do that. Then imagine the whole world blowing up and everything still being okay. Okay, I guess I can hold that.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, man, I go to some of my favorite places in the desert, and I see an oil well there sitting in San Rafael Swell, and it pisses me off, and I want to, yell at those people. I'm definitely not, insane to it at that moment, as am not any other moment.
Yeah.
For sure, yeah. But I'm still okay, especially if we didn't have time to talk about this, but like, who am I anyway? When I say I'm okay, who is the I, right? And it's, I mean, that's a whole nother hour, right? If not a year or a lifetime to think about that. But, when I think about I'm okay, I don't think I'm okay like, this body and my persona. It's something else.
We have a good practical question too from Pascal again. Do you have recommendations about dialoguing with people who are ideologically across a divide and seem unreachable? Politics and religion, question mark.
Yeah, what a great question. We study, Moira's in our conversation, and we have a dialogue class that meets every week for 15 weeks. It's meeting in a few minutes, and we practice this for 15 weeks, and we're just putting our toes in the water. It's really as hard as it feels, you know, to play by the dialogue guidelines, listen to understand, speak respectfully. When someone doesn't do that back, it's really hard, and we don't want to be a doormat and let people abuse us. But on the other hand, I think, maybe Martin Luther King said it best when he said, forgiveness is the only attitude that can change the hearts of your enemies, whether they like it or not. It's a cool idea.
I couldn't quite acoustically hear. Can you speak
Oh,
up in the quote one
sure.
more time?
Yeah,
That would be great.
Martin Luther King said, forgiveness is the only attitude that can change the hearts of your enemies, whether they like it or not. And it always makes me smile. I think it's kind of a cool idea.
It is.
It's sort of being subversive in a little bit more enlightened way. So I guess I could try that. And forgiveness, all it means is just letting go of anger, resentment. It doesn't mean like I think what you did's okay. And you stepped on my toes really hard.
I just want to read out a few more comments just as we're reaching the time that you need to go and run to your classroom on the other Zoom channel. Incredible, useful time together. Thank you. Melinda writes, very helpful. Thank you so much. Sandy, what a great, all in capital letters, presentation an hour. Thank you. So enjoyable, useful, and informative. I hope we can do this again as a follow-up.
Wow.
Sarah writes, thank you so much, Dr. Dave. It was lovely to see you. And I echo the other participants that said too much to type, turning inwards to my journal as well. Lewis says, excellent views that build on some of them. My meditation practice. Thank you for sharing.
Wow.
Pascal, thank you. Lucy,
Wow.
I loved every moment. Thank you, Lucy.
Oh.
Bill, thank you.
I can't handle anymore. That's
They're
enough.
rolling just in. It's just
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
list
Thank
of
you.
things. And I
Yeah.
do want to echo that as well. Joe
Thank
says
you.
too, thank you. Thanks for your time today and
Yeah.
for making us all think, and reflect and go inward and help me a lot.
Yeah.
From our conversation before we rolled, I pondered with a good friend who is on the other side of the political spectrum and her comments and how can I meet her. And thanks for enlightening me about the radical middle. I'm striving to be there. So
Well, from one scalp dominant person to another, thank you, Christoph. And thanks to
yes,
Jen. That's why I wear this hat in the winter, because my head gets cold. And thank you so much to everybody for hanging out with us. And I hope I get an A I hope I pass the audition, as John
you'll
Lennon
pass
said.
the audition with flying colors.
Okay.
We'll have you back soon again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone out there. Be safe, have fun, go in nature and reflect. Thank you.